What exactly do we want from art? WandaVision wrapped up its first season recently. By all accounts, it was a massive success. The show was many things to many people, and a lot of those things were quite interesting of themselves. It was the MCU's first proper foray into the medium of television, sorry Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It was an exploration of the evolution of the American domestic sitcom over decades. It was a potent metaphor for what it felt like to be trapped in a monoculture dominated by Marvel Studios. Also, it's a potent metaphor for what it felt like to be trapped on Twitter talking about WandaVision. It was also an aspirational tale about a superhero battling evil in sweatpants, which is a very 2021 mood.
Not the hero we deserved, but the hero we needed.
It was also a modern variation on what might be termed the Mystery Box show, a show that began with a mysterious setup and then gradually revealed itself to the audience. Early episodes of WandaVision parceled out information sparingly, inviting the audience to wonder what had happened to Wanda Maximoff and Vision, and why the world that they inhabited suddenly looked like a trip through sitcom history. This was a canny strategy for a studio embracing weekly television. Much like Disney had managed to turn spoiler culture and continuity references into marketing tools to drive demand from fans, WandaVision turned this weekly setup into a vibrant fan economy. Shows like our own Marvelous Escape had fun each week speculating about what was happening and what it meant. And to be frank, often getting it very, very wrong.
What if that town had a mutant surge?
Like, we think we're smarter than this show. I don't think we are.
This drove interest and fear of missing out, which made the show must-see TV for fans around the world, and explained how demand for the series appears to have crashed Disney Plus's servers on more than one occasion. These early episodes were compelling and interesting of themselves, raising uncomfortable and confrontational questions. They invited questions about domesticity, the idea of a powerful woman transformed into a domestic wife. They raised questions about the ubiquity of American culture, and contrasting the influence of these sitcoms on Wanda's childhood with the bomb that dropped on her house and killed her family. They also perhaps suggested the horror and nightmare of living in a world soaked in 50s and 60s nostalgia, suffocating any sense of individuality. Ultimately, the finale of WandaVision adopted an approach that is perhaps best described as having the cake and eating it too. It answered most of the important questions about the plot, but often in ways both obvious and contradictory. Wanda had to say goodbye to her imaginary children, but a post-credits scene suggested they were still out there somewhere in the multiverse. Wanda also lost her version of Vision, but Vision's memories were helpfully reignited in his reanimated corpse, which is now out there somewhere in the world, presumably waiting to be reunited with Wanda in a future project. Although the show did leave certain smaller mysteries lingering, like what the hell happened to Jimmy Woo's informant, it went out of its way to tidy up any potential loose ends. In one detail I particularly liked, it was revealed that the false version of Quicksilver, or Pietro as it were, was actually an actor named Ralph
Boner?
Boner.
I'm not going to pretend that I didn't chuckle at that. What was most revealing about the finale was its complete rejection of any lingering ambiguity. Everything was explained. Nothing was left to linger. This extends to character beats as much as plot. While WandaVision revealed that Wanda had enslaved an entire town to relive her nostalgic fantasy, the show refused to leave the audience to think about how they should feel about that.
Heroes don't torture people.
Consider, for example, the shot of Wanda leaving Westview. She walks through the crowd, the camera close on her face. The inhabitants of the town stare at her, grouped together, in wide shot. The camera invites us to empathize with Wanda rather than the people that she terrorized. Indeed, the last word in the sequence is given to Monica Rambeau, who tells Wanda,
They'll never know what you sacrificed for them.
The final episode of WandaVision stops just short of playing Don't You Forget About Me as Wanda flies out of Westview. This complete rejection of ambiguity perhaps reflects broader trends in contemporary pop culture. In the internet age, audiences seem particularly wary of the idea of ambiguity and nuance. Instead, everything is handily explained and dissected. Explainer articles and videos have become part of the internet economy, to the point that even films like arthouse darling Wong Kar-wai's deeply moving and impressionistic romance In the Mood for Love has received the ending explained treatment. Audiences seem to resent ambiguity. They seem to prefer the idea of fixed meaning. More than a decade after The Sopranos ended, creator David Chase was still being asked about the final episode's ambiguous closing shot. More than a decade after Lost ended, Vulture still had to headline its retrospective, No, They Weren't Dead All Along. These arguments about imposing meaning reduce art to puzzles in need of solution. It wasn't always like this. Shows like Lost and WandaVision were both frequently compared to the classic British television show The Prisoner, which embraced surrealism and absurdity while refusing a single, clear, definitive interpretation, even in its closing episode. In American television, David Lynch and Mark Frost's Twin Peaks often refused to make sense, creating an experience that needed to be felt as much as understood. Part of the thrill of Twin Peaks: The Return was the revival's active resistance and inscrutability in the face of recap and explainer culture.
Brilliant! I have absolutely no idea what's going on.
Sometimes ambiguity is the point of the exercise. Much digital ink has been spilled over the ending of Inception, about whether that final shot means that Dominic Cobb is in the real world or still trapped in a dream. The movie pointedly refuses to answer that question, and so fans have gone frame by frame to provide their own definitive answers. This attempt for definitive meaning ignores the possibility that the entire point of the scene is that it no longer matters to Cobb whether he's in the real world or in a dream. And that is the meaning of the scene. There have been efforts to push back on this obsession with explanation and mystery box plotting, but they are polarizing. Part of what made The Last Jedi so frustrating to certain fans was the fact that Rian Johnson rejected the idea of mystery box storytelling as an end unto itself. To The Last Jedi, the identity of Rey's parents was not a hook to a continuity reference, but a piece of character work of itself. The answer only mattered in what it revealed about Rey's character, not how it connected to the canon.
You have no place in this story. You come from nothing. You're nothing.
Along those lines, writer Stephen Moffat spent extended stretches of his tenure on Doctor Who openly spoofing mystery box storytelling. He literally put the Doctor inside a giant mystery box in his first season finale. As if to underscore the point, the 11th Doctor spends most of his tenure learning to treat the women in his life, like Amy, River, and Clara, as complicated and multifaceted people, rather than as puzzles to be solved. This approach seems quite pointed, given that Stephen Moffat took over Doctor Who at a point where Neil Strauss's The Game was teaching young men that women were in fact puzzles to be solved, and riddles that could be unraveled, and games that could be played. Following that, the 12th Doctor spends most of his second season haunted by prophecies of an ominous hybrid.
Is that what you ran from, Doctor? Your part in the coming of the hybrid?
However, Moffat was ridiculing how ridiculously oversignified such storytelling was. After all, his direct predecessor, Russell T Davies, tended to build episode and storytelling arcs around words repeated over and over and over again, such as
Torchwood, 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 Torchwood.
Davies would seed these words and then pay them off in the finale in order to set up revelations and possibly even later spin-offs.
Welcome to Torchwood.
In contrast, Moffat used the hybrid storytelling element in order to mock this sort of setup and payoff. This idea that the entire universe was building in an arc towards one inescapable conclusion. Over the course of the 9th season, the Doctor realized that pretty much anything could be seen as a hybrid.
So in a way, she's a hybrid.
I am human and Zygon.
Like a hybrid.
Everyone's a bit of both. Everyone's a hybrid.
Indeed, the entire point of the 9th season finale was to reject an epic mythos-shattering continuity-heavy story.
It doesn't matter what the hybrid is, it only matters that I convinced them that I knew.
In favor of something more intimate and personal, rejecting the call of Doctor Who continuity and canon in favor of a story about two friends struggling to make their peace with one another. So why are audiences so anxious about ambiguity and so fixated on the idea of a singular definitive interpretation of a text? There are probably several factors at play here. Part of it is just basic human psychology. The human brain has a desire to recognize patterns even where they don't exist. This often extends to efforts to imbue meaning to things that are arbitrary, chaotic, or random, and to insist that such meaning is objective, rather than simply an individual's perception.
She and her boyfriend intended to make a piece of cheese toast for a late-night snack, but when it came out of the oven, it was seen as the image of Christ.
The problem is compounded because the more information that human beings process, the greater the desire to filter that information in an efficient way. The internet has only accelerated this trend, making more media and more information more readily available to more people, to the point of overwhelming the human brain. In the real world, this exhaustion with information manifests itself in the wide embrace of conspiracy theories, which provide ordering narratives for a chaotic world. It's no coincidence that one of the first modern television shows to grapple with this desire for an overarching explanation was The X-Files, which was both a show literally about conspiracy theories and one of the first shows to engage with an active online fan base. Over the years, the consensus on The X-Files has become that the show's central mythology doesn't really make sense or hold water. Given that the series finale essentially borrows the same structural format as the series finale of Seinfeld, that's probably fair. However, it also discounts the effectiveness of that central mythology in capturing a pervasive cultural mood. even if it doesn't necessarily cohere.
For although we may not be alone in the universe, in our own separate ways, we are all alone.
However, even outside of broader societal factors that might inform the modern discomfort with ambiguity, there are also forces at work within pop culture itself. The advent of the internet led to the aggregation of reviews, suggesting that the value of a piece of media could be reduced to a single score, perhaps even a binary value of fresh or rotten. Of course, this was just an acceleration of a trend that began with Roger Ebert's classic thumbs up or thumbs down, but it was accelerated by the internet. While this was happening, there was an increasing discourse around the idea that reviews and criticism should be objective. What objective actually meant in this context was highly debatable, given that any individual's reaction to a work of art is inherently subjective. If the argument was that reviews both could and should be objective in determining the value of a piece of art, then surely it was just as easy to objectively determine a work of art's single unifying meaning. And so with that, movies became riddles to be solved. It became common to critique movies for containing plot holes, as if these were objective measures of a movie's worth.
I defy you to find a story problem.
All right. If Indiana Jones weren't in the movie, the Nazis would have still found the Ark, taken it to the island, opened it up, and all died. Just like they did.
This fixation on plot holes and continuity and details was a problem compounded in an age of intellectual properties that came with a host of continuity and canon that turned them into games of spot the reference for fans in the audience.
What are we going to call this guy?
Doctor Strange.
That's pretty good. But it's taken.
Suddenly, the worth of a work of art could be measured more reliably by its fidelity and its connections to pre-existing media, as what was known as curative fandom, the fandom obsessed with lists and facts and statistics, went increasingly mainstream. Think of how many film and television shows make a big deal of characters showing up and declaring their identity in a way that makes no sense unless the work assumes the audience's pre-existing familiarity with the character.
My name is Khan.
Everything has an antecedent. Meaning is predetermined. Everything corresponds or maps to something else. Everything can be tethered in some way to the larger franchise. And the audience is always told exactly how they should feel about it. This ignores the reality that things like meaning don't necessarily exist bottled up in the art itself. They exist in the relationship between the art and the culture around it, and between the art and the audience consuming it. Part of the joy of recording a series like In the Frame, outside of working with very talented people like Omar, is getting to explore what a piece of art means to me, articulating what I see in it and what I read in it. It's in navigating that space and understanding that I probably see something very different in Twin Peaks than David Lynch does. For example, I look at this scene and I see a representation of evil and corruption infecting normal suburban life. David Lynch looks at it and he remembers a time that he traveled around Europe with his brother.
Frog moths were pulling themselves out of the earth and flying up in front of the stand. We're cooking quinoa.
In a recent article for Current Affairs, Ashley McRae discussed what she called the death of mythos. The idea that audiences have grown increasingly obsessed with literalism and rejecting any search for meaning not presented by the text itself. This is compounded by a pop culture dominated by shared universes, where what a thing means is constantly confined both by reference to the source material that informed it and to the next project looming on the horizon, essentially turning pop culture into a giant decoder ring for fans. To bring it all back to WandaVision, what was so refreshing about those opening weeks was the ambiguity. The use of negative space to suggest possibilities and interpretations outside of those that a rigid framework like the MCU usually allows. Naturally, as the show continued, that negative space was flooded with a bland, color-corrected aesthetic associated with the MCU. Everything had an explanation. Everything made sense. Everybody knew how they were supposed to feel in a given moment. In the end, afraid to leave its audience sitting with potentially uncomfortable questions, WandaVision felt like its own explainer article. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was In the Frame.